Hello again biologists, Mr. Kinnear here with another video lesson for higher biology. We're on Unit 3, Sustainability and Interdependence, and today we're going to look at biodiversity. As you can see, we're at the end of the unit and therefore the course, and we're putting together today two key areas, 3.7 which is Components of Biodiversity and 3.8 Threat to Biodiversity. Biodiversity is a term you'll have heard of before in third year and National 5 biology. It obviously means the variety of life on Earth, and we know that the places where we have the biggest biodiversity are tropical rainforests, coral reefs, the deep sea and large tropical lakes. In these places we're still finding new organisms, new species that we've never come across before, and that's due to two things. Obviously these places are a bit more difficult to get to, but also the variety that we do find in life, we're still finding new species there. Humans rely on biodiversity for raw materials, foods, chemicals and medicines, but we also need the ecosystem services, and that term is something we talked about during key area 3.6 when we're talking about social insects and the ecosystem services they provide. So we need nutrient recycling, water purification, pollination and pest control as well. The loss of biodiversity reduces the availability of ecosystem services and other products, and it also damages the ability to adapt to changes in environmental conditions. So biodiversity is almost an insurance policy against natural disasters. And if we have high biodiversity, it's likely that we have a few species that will be able to adapt to any change in conditions that may occur. Measuring biodiversity is therefore incredibly useful, so we can find which areas and species need support to maintain that biodiversity for the future. We can also then monitor changes and pollution in the environment, and then preserve the wonders of the planet, but also prevent species from becoming extinct. And there are three areas of biodiversity that we must look at in order to measure biodiversity fully. So genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity, and I'll talk you through each of those individually. Genetic diversity is the number and frequency of all alleles of the genes possessed by its members. So it's the genetic diversity that gives a species the ability to adapt to changing conditions, and that loss of that reduces a species' viability for survival. Genetic diversity may provide us things like new food sources, and as we discussed at the start of this unit, most food comes from only about 20 species. Those supplies may be at risk due to disease. New fuel sources. Fossil fuels are running out, so we need alternatives. And the same goes for things like raw materials and the petrochemicals that are provided by fossil fuels. Nearly all of the medicines are derived from plants, and we're still finding some new medicines from plants and species we're finding in those areas of tropical biodiversity. And also crop plants. So the genes that make organisms more productive, more resistant to disease, or produce higher yields can be bred into existing stocks, therefore improving our food production from our existing crop plants. In terms of species diversity, we need to look at two factors. The richness of the species, so the number of different species present in an ecosystem, but then the relative abundance of each of those species, so the proportion of each species within the ecosystem. And I'll show you a quick example to see the difference. In this example, we're comparing two communities from two different ecosystems. As you can see from the table, they share the same species richness. So both communities 1 and 2 have species A to F. You'll also see that they differ in terms of relative abundance. So community 1 is dominated by species A, it's 60% of the abundance, and community 2, it's a lot more even. So you'll also spot that species D and E are only 5% of the abundance within community 1, which means they can be easily lost from that ecosystem. And that would be a problem if that's a species that provides ecosystem services or a food source for other species within that community. So we will say that community 1 has a lower species diversity than community 2. So the third and final measure of biodiversity is ecosystem diversity. That's then the number of distinct ecosystems within a defined area. And even in this simple picture, we've got a stream, we've got grassland, woodland, might have marsh area. They obviously then provide different habitats and conditions for different species to live there. And that leads us on to Key Area 3.8, threats to biodiversity, most of these being man-made impacts on biodiversity, some of which you'll have come across in S3 and National 5 biology, some of which may be new to you. The first threat to biodiversity is over-exploitation, and you saw an example of that on the previous slide with deforestation. So to exploit a natural resource means to make the best use of it. But to overexploit means to remove and use up the individuals at a rate that is greater than the reproduction of that species. And a prime example of that is overfishing. So that's a case of fish, whales and marine invertebrates. So overfishing is a process where we reduce the number of some species to such a low level that their continued exploitation is no longer sustainable. And we saw that with a number of species in the North Sea, particularly cod, where cod levels got down to a really dramatically low level where we thought we might have no cod left in the North Sea. Thankfully, measures were put in place and agreements in terms of quotas and the number of boats fishing. That then had a dramatic effect on the stocks, and we're now back to kind of normal levels. So we can take steps to stop it, so therefore we can recover some species. If not, they will become extinct. And the measures that were put in place in the North Sea weren't without their complications. So you had discards, which meant that a fishing boat would then pick up a variety of fish. They would then just discard stuff that was out with their quota or stuff they shouldn't be taking. Now the problem there being is that they're actually still killing that fish, and therefore you're still reducing the stocks and numbers of those fish within the North Sea. You're not bringing them ashore to sell, but you're still actually reducing the number. So that did also have some of its complications, but thankfully we have managed to get our North Sea fishing within check, and therefore we're not overexploiting. But there are still some areas around the world where that overexploitation, that overfishing is definitely still happening, and therefore causing a huge amount of problems. We've talked about grazing before when it was livestock and food production, but this could mean any grazing animal, including the deer that we have around the northeast of Scotland. And you may well know that they do cause problems for tree growers, as the deer will eat the tree saplings, and therefore overgrazing will cause massive problems for those industries, and they need to be kept in check. But grazing does have some good and bad issues. So low levels of grazing, then a small number of aggressive competitors are taking over in this graph. So they may be a dominant species which are quick growing, and therefore they outcompete other species. As grazing increases, the dominant species are held in check, allowing other species to increase, so we get a better amount of species diversity. But again, as grazing further increases, we're getting an over-exploitation, so less species are able to tolerate the grazing, and you do get certain times where fields or areas are overgrazed, and that then reduces the species diversity and therefore causes problems. The next threat to biodiversity is known as the bottleneck effect. Now that could be due to some kind of disaster, so fire, flood, earthquake, so a natural disaster, or some of those can be man-made. But it's unselective, and a population can be almost wiped out. So if a small number of that population is left, then the genetic diversity or variation needed to adapt to future changes may be lost. That then is referred to as suffered a bottleneck effect or been through a bottleneck event. So here we have a visual representation of that. So on the left hand side, we've got a bottle full of coloured beads showing the genetic variation of the original population. That looks a fairly even split of yellow and blue beads. But as you can see, as we're pouring that out, it goes through the bottleneck effect. So there's a drastic reduction in the population. And that third container shows the surviving individuals. As you can see, there's far more blue than yellow, and therefore there's a less of a genetic variation and different allele frequencies in that population, leading on to the next generation having far less genetic variation than the original parent population on the left hand side. Our next threat to biodiversity is something that is definitely man-made, and we've seen it in Scotland over centuries. So it's habitat loss by fragmentation, and that then is resulting in the formation of several habitat fragments. Now Scotland pretty much used to be forest from coast to coast, from north to south. But that's obviously not the case through industrial and residential and transport infrastructure being put in. So you can see on our right hand side we've got a grey box which represents habitat, which is then split into two, and as you can see it's then further degraded around the edges. So the total surface area of the fragments is less than that of the original habitat, and then you get further degradation around the edges. So it obviously leads to further decrease and loss of habitat. And small habitats can only support a small number of populations, so that reduces the species richness. You then get animals isolated from other fragments and therefore unable to recolonise and reproduce. There'll be limited resources. And you'll then get small populations which are more vulnerable to extinction, like we saw back in our species diversity discussion. And the ecosystems are not uniform across the area. So we had this large grey box, and you may have had some species that lived right in the middle of the grey box, which are now at the edge. And therefore there's different characteristics, different conditions from the interior and the edge, and therefore that will then cause problems for animals that are used to those conditions. One of the major causes of habitat fragmentation is the development of transport infrastructure, and we've seen that quite recently in the northeast with the development of the Aberdeen bypass. That's cut through a variety of different ecosystems, including a number of woodland and forest areas. And these habitat corridors are seen as a solution to these isolated habitats, and the Aberdeen bypass does actually include a couple of different habitat corridors. So they are narrow strips or a series of smaller clumps of quality habitats that species can use to move between the disconnected habitats. And that's got a number of different benefits. So colonization, allowing animals to move and occupy new areas when food sources become scarce in their core habitat. They can migrate and relocate seasonally without the need for human interference or the potential, the danger obviously of crossing major roads and thoroughfares. And interbreeding, so they can find new mates in neighbouring regions so that genetic diversity can increase within that population. Another threat to biodiversity are introduced species. So over the years, many foreign species have been introduced to the UK, and some of those have become invasive and had a negative impact on the ecosystem. So an introduced or non-native species are those that humans have moved either intentionally or accidentally to new geographical locations. Now, prime examples come from like the British Empire, when people have gone to our colonies, the Caribbean, Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and taken back plants they thought they looked nice or maybe had some properties that we were quite keen on, and brought them back to the UK. Some of them can then become a problem. And equally, in terms of accidental, when we take our boat somewhere, then potentially that leads on to dogs or rats jumping off ship and therefore colonising those places. And so that then becomes an issue. So when a non-native species is introduced to a new location, they become naturalised and become established in the wild environment, and not necessarily a problem. So for instance, the false acacia is now an introduced natural species within the UK. They can become a problem. So when a naturalised species starts to spread rapidly and outcompete the native species, they then become invasive. That invasive species then preys upon the resources of the community. And that's because the things that normally attack the species are not present. So pathogens, competitors, parasites and predators won't kill it off because they're not present. That allows the population to go unchecked, and they increase rapidly in numbers. One of the examples is the Japanese knotweed, an incredibly fast growing plant that will actually grow through concrete. Now this has caused lots of problems for it growing within gardens or amongst foundations of houses, because it can cause instability for walls and foundations, and therefore it becomes incredibly difficult when it's not treated to get a mortgage on those properties. That then has a knock-on effect and cause a loss of biodiversity, with many of the invasive species posing a threat to native species found in the UK. A prime example of that you'll be familiar with is the red squirrel, which is at risk of extinction due to the introduction of the grey squirrel from North America, which is outcompeting it for resources, breeding rapidly, and also carrying disease which can affect the red squirrel. That's been further exacerbated by habitat fragmentation. As I said earlier, Scotland used to be forest from coast to coast, north to south, which would allow the red squirrel to escape and find new habitat. but obviously because of habitat fragmentation, escaping is far more difficult than it would have been a long time ago. Another example would be the rhododendron, which again looks lovely, but it is an invasive species that's taken over the countryside and competing with native plant species. That then in turn leads to loss of the associated native animals, which would maybe feed or shelter within the native plant species. And that's just two examples, but we do have a huge amount of invasive species that are really causing us problems, and you can have a look at those and find out a bit more. That then leads us to the end of the biodiversity topic, the end of Unit 3 and indeed the whole course. So today we've looked at biodiversity, which is important for providing raw materials, food and medicine, but also vital ecosystem services. We can measure biodiversity through genetic diversity, species diversity and ecosystem diversity. And we've also learned a huge amount of the threats to biodiversity which humans have been a massive part of. I mean, we have a duty of care to protect the biodiversity for us and all the other species that we impact on. So hopefully you found that interesting and informative. As always, if you have any problems, questions or queries, get in touch and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye.